In most histories of King Philip's War, the Native American side of the story is monopolized by the three big nations who fought against the English: the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett. But there were other native groups that played a smaller role in the conflict, with their own stories of that turbulent time. Among these more obscure tribes were the Penacook people of southern New Hampshire. When the Puritans of the Great Migration established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s, the Penacook sachem Passaconaway began a lifelong policy of appeasement toward these strange foreigners from across the sea. His heir Wanalancet ascended to the throne sometime in the 1660s, and he continued this policy. In the summer of 1675, King Philip's War broke out, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony began to get very nervous about Wanalancet's intentions, especially since strange Indians had been seen threatening towns south of the Merrimack River. But these warriors were definitely Nipmuc, not Penacook, because in point of fact, by this time, Wanalancet had led his people prematurely north to his winter capital near the site of present-day Concord, New Hampshire, just to get as far away from the war as he possibly could. However, the move raised the suspicions of the notorious Massachusetts Bay militia captain Samuel Mosley, who had been assigned to reinforce the Merrimack River settlements. And this guy, I swear to fucking God, this fucking guy, whenever New Englanders mistreat Indians, this guy is always fucking there. So in September, Mosley ordered a preemptive strike on the Penacook's winter capital. Wanalancet ordered his warriors to stand down and allow Mosley to burn their wigwams and destroy their winter stores. And he still did not retaliate. By hook or by crook, Wanalancet was going to preserve his neutrality. So he led his people even further north, to the headwaters of the Connecticut River, and the Penacook sat out much of the war in these northern regions. When they finally returned to the lower Merrimack, they found that a year of home front war had made the English hateful and mistrustful. So Wanalancet renewed his pledge to keep the peace by signing a treaty with the English at Dover, New Hampshire, under the watchful eye of an English tradesman and militia officer named Major Richard Waldron. The war in southern New England ended just a couple months later, but peace did not bring stability for the Native Americans of the region, and the Penacook soon found themselves in the midst of a full-blown refugee crisis, as non-combatant Indians from the destroyed nations surged north and west, desperately trying to escape English rangers and slave catchers. The Penacook took a bunch of these refugees in, as was the custom among northeastern woodland native nations at this time. But soon the English got wind of this, and generally it made them very nervous when neutral nations took in refugees from hostile ones. In fact, that was their whole justification for their attack that destroyed the Narragansett back in December of 1675. So in September of 1676, Major Waldron invited Wanalancet to a big feast outside of his house in Dover. It was very much an open invitation, and hundreds of Penacook ended up coming. Now, you will sometimes hear a version of this story that states that it was a militia drill meant to recruit Penacook soldiers into service for the English, but this is contradicted by Waldron's own testimony in a letter to the Massachusetts Council dated September 6th. That's it right there, which unambiguously states that it was a big dinner. He also states that there were only about 80 men of fighting age in attendance, with about 20 muskets between them, the rest being about 250 women and children. In the midst of the feast, which probably involved copious amounts of alcohol, Waldron sprang his trap. English militiamen sprang out of hiding and rounded up the terrified natives at sword point. A few Narragansett and Nipmuc refugees were found among them, but the vast majority were, of course, friendly Penacooks. In flagrant violation of the peace treaty Waldron had signed just 2 months earlier, most of the natives captured at Dover were sent in chains to Boston to, quote, determine their case, which for most meant a noose on the common or a lifetime of backbreaking labor on a Barbados sugar plantation. We don't know exactly what happened to Wanalancet at this point, but he disappears from the historical record. In all likelihood, he met a dismal end, swinging from a scaffold. He was the last sachem of the Penacook. What remained of their people after the betrayal at Dover fled north, where they were absorbed into the Abenaki nations of the mountains of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Nations that would, in just a few short years, reorganize into the powerful Wabanaki Confederacy. Which brings us to King William's War. If the 10-year interbellum had made the colonies more cosmopolitan, it also made the native groups of the region more politically centralized. While a far cry from French-style absolutism, the level of cooperation among these nations as gigantic confederacies was basically unheard of before this period. The Abenaki, the main ethnic and linguistic group of the Wabanaki, had actually fought in King Philip's War too, and their war against the English had lasted a full 2 years longer than the Wampanoags. And what's more, they won. The Abenaki put so much pressure on the main frontier that the English were forced to abandon all their settlements north of the Saco River. And in April of 1678, the Penobscot sachem Mokawando actually was able to force the English to sign a treaty which agreed to respect native land rights. But neither side expected the peace to hold for very long. The formation of the Wabanaki Confederacy as a united military polity attests to that, as does their increasing cooperation with New France. Quebecois missionaries and tradesmen had been courting the Wabanaki for decades, and the relationship between these two groups was exceptionally strong, far stronger than that between the English and the Haudenosaunee. Some French even lived among the Wabanaki as one of their own, such as Mokawando's own son-in-law, Jean-Vincent d'Abbadie, the Baron de Saint-Castin. Saint-Castin would be a war leader in King Philip's War and go on to be an important sachem in King William's. The French certainly had their own colonial ambitions, and at least at the administrative level thought of the Wabanaki as more of a means to an end than anything else. But unlike the English, they had ingratiated themselves in the indigenous socio-political fabric. They had adopted the customs and mores of North America rather than cling to those of Europe. The result was that this alliance was less of a superior and subordinate type of relationship and more of a collaboration among peers. And while King William's War was instigated by New France, decisions of direct strategic command were made by the Wabanaki, as is evidenced by their choice of targets. Something that many European chroniclers at the time did not appreciate was that the Algonquin way of war was highly pre-planned and narrow in its focus. The best word I could use to describe it would be surgical. Native brutality could be extreme, but it was never indiscriminate. Targets were chosen to avenge a wrong of the past or achieve a specific strategic goal, which is why in June of 1689, a Wabanaki force co-led by the Penacook warrior Kankamangas descended on Dover, New Hampshire. Dover was chosen as the first target of the new war for a very good reason, and that reason's name was Major Richard Waldron. The evening of the attack was rainy, which covered the Wabanaki's approach. Waldron was taken completely by surprise as warriors, almost certainly relatives of those Waldron had betrayed, burst into his room and rushed forward. Waldron barely had enough time to get out of bed and grab his sword before he was fighting for his life, but he was quickly overpowered, and the warriors tied him to a chair. In mocking reference to Waldron's civilian profession as a traitor, the warriors dragged their knives over his belly, and as they did so, each said, "I cross out my account." After a lengthy torture, they impaled him with his own sword.